packing this room. It's wonderful to see you all today, especially to honor and give a warm send-off to Father Columba Stewart, who many of you know. I'm not going to go through a litany of all of his scholarly achievements and all of this kind of stuff. What I want to do is simply say a couple of words, first of all, about Phi Beta Kappa. We have a Phi Beta Kappa chapter here at St. John's and St. Ben's. We've had it active since 2010. And when we found out that Father Columba was going to be a Phi Beta Kappa visiting scholar going to other schools all over the country, we just had to have him first. So we're really thrilled about that. And then when we found out about the Jefferson lecture, well, that was just icing on the cake. So congratulations on it. When I saw the title of his talk, What a Modern Monk Does, my first reaction was to try and come up with a Gilbert and Sullivan lyric, but I failed dismally at that. So I just thought I would say one thing personal about you that has to do with that. Back in the fall of 2000, I started teaching a class that many of you students have taken called FYS, First Year Seminar. And one of the things I wanted to do as part of that class was to ground my students in a sense of these places. And I used this book that I will actually pass around by Columba called Prayer and Community, the Benedictine Tradition. To me, it's still the best book for learning about what these places are all about and what monasticism is all about. And I wanted to have the students take a tour and learn about the places, and you were gracious enough to actually lead them. I said, where could I get somebody? And you were like, well, I'll do it. And I was just so touched. And everything that he does, he is truly a modern monk. So we're lucky to have him with us today, Father Columba.
Thank you, Louis. I'm really happy to be here, and I'm really happy to be able to practice a very initial version of the lecture I'll take on the road. Like so many of us who do this kind of thing, I have too many slides, and I'm going to rely on you to signal by bored, apathetic faces when I have to cut one or shorten a story. And I know I can count on my colleagues at Himmel to do that. So this is the first of what will be six in addition to this, visits to Phi Beta Kappa chapters around the country. And the thing I love about the Phi Beta Kappa Visiting Scholar Series is they deliberately don't send the visiting scholars to places like Harvard or Yale. They really want them to go to schools which are smaller and don't have that kind of access, which is a really great mission. And in some ways, it's like the mission of these colleges, which have such a history of first-generation students, such a tradition of reaching into the local and regional communities, even as they change so dramatically in recent years. So what a great start. And away we go. So this is a Phi Beta Kappa lecture, right? So if it's under that aegis, we have to be a little nerdy. And so what I'm going to do before we get to the kind of exciting travelogue part of our program, where I talk about the work of Himmel and the things I've been involved in various parts of the world, I need to say something about what a manuscript actually is. And I'm going to start by telling you the story of how much fun you can have researching with manuscripts. But to help us, I've actually got one. And just as Louis passed my book around, I'm going to pass this one around. It's not a valuable manuscript. I do want it back. It's a personal manuscript. It's probably 19th century. It's a little prayer book in Syriac. But it makes the point that in the pre-modern period, and in many parts of the world even today, if people want a book, they have to write it out by hand. So this is somebody's prayer book, devotional things from the liturgy, and other prayers like that. And it is a handwritten book. If you've ever tried to make a manuscript or copy out an extensive text by hand, it's a lot of work. So you're pretty careful about what you decide to copy. So the story I want to tell you is one that begins to introduce the notion that manuscripts, in a way, were the first Internet of Things, because you had all of these manuscripts scattered across the world which were interconnected because they had the same texts, or they moved from one part of the world to the other, or they had texts that were translated from one language to another, often with surprising results. And part of the fun of working with manuscripts, like we get to do at Himmel, like I do in my own research, which is the story I'll tell here, is that you get to follow those pathways. So there's an element of discovery and detective work, which is increased by the fact that every manuscript is a unique creation. Unlike printed books, where every copy is the same, every manuscript is different because it has a different set of hands, normally a different set of hands, involved in copying it. And sometimes you had scribes with attitude who tried to change the text a little bit. This is bad grammar. What's that spelling? This is a little controversial, so they might tone it back or they might amp it up. They might make mistakes. They might be sleepy and copy the same line twice or leave a line out. And you also might have manuscripts that have a shorter version of a text, more sort of concise but designed to achieve perhaps a slightly different purpose from the original one. And so the work of manuscript study is tracking down all the copies you can find, knowing that you always have a small fraction of what there used to be. So we're sort of finding remnants in various places, and then trying to construct some kind of narrative or understanding. So let me tell you about this little adventure I got into, or maybe it's best called a kind of rabbit hole. I'm really interested in a 3rd century Christian theologian named Origen. And anybody who's ever taken a class from me knows who this is. Most brilliant theologian in the history of the Christian church. How's that for a claim? And I stand by it.
Next to you.
So, much more prolific. 3rd century, he's an Egyptian, but he's a Greek culture, Hellenized Egyptian, living in Alexandria, Egypt, which was a real center for Greek learning, ancient times and in the early Christian period. And Origen wrote incredibly visionary theology, commentaries on books of scripture. And he was also early enough in his thinking before the great councils of the church that he sort of experimented a little with some of his speculations, which really got him in trouble 100 years later, when some of those questions that were open at one time suddenly seemed closed. So the result of this is that a lot of his stuff is lost. So we have only some of it left in Greek. We have more in Latin, so we're sort of reconstruct a Greek writer on the basis of Latin. And this happens all the time in the study of texts and manuscripts, that for whatever reason, something goes out of favor or is pushed out of its native tradition, and then has a whole kind of flourishing other life in the translated versions of the text. So I was asking myself the question about Origen. Why isn't Origen found in Syriac? This is the Syriac language. It's Christian Aramaic. It has its own script. He was such an important theologian for many people who were venerated in Syriac tradition. You would think you would find traces of his own writings. And this is a case where the translation of Greek theology into the Syriac language, which was really a project of the 5th and 6th centuries, happened after Origen's reputation had been tainted, with the result that they wouldn't touch his writings. But I did find in one manuscript catalog of the British Library a mention of a text that actually used his name. So here's the name of Origen, written in Syriac. Actually, you will find his name in other places, but you'll find it written upside down, which is what you write, how you write the name of a heretic in Syriac. How's that, right? You know, so you sort of make a point. But here he is actually being referred to, and it's an excerpt of one of Origen's commentaries on the Book of Psalms. And this particular manuscript is a certain form of the Book of Psalms in Syriac, but one that is translated not from the Hebrew, but from the Greek version, which was known in Alexandria, that Origen himself knew as basically his Old Testament, that Greek version. And as a preface to that translation of the Psalms, they have little excerpts of things by various writers which are explaining the significance of the Psalms. And so that's what this is. So then I thought to myself, well, if there's this one, there must be other manuscripts with this same little collection of blurbs used for the same purpose. First, I had to figure out where they came from. So there's a Greek manuscript in Oxford, and it's dated to 9th to 11th century. Note the Syriac one is older, but this seems to be the original text, which then was translated into Syriac and used as a preface to these different psalters. As so often happens, the oldest Greek manuscript is later than the Syriac ones because Greek manuscripts were typically kept in places where the weather did not favor preserving manuscripts, whereas Syriac manuscripts survived because many of them actually were taken to Egypt, and Egypt is a perfect place for a manuscript. So if you're wondering what to do with your own manuscript collection, Egypt is one option, but it'd be a lot easier just to give them to Himmel because we have a really nice vault we can put it in. So I found another manuscript, and this one is a little later than the one that's in the British Library. This was in Milan. Then I found other manuscripts. There's one in St. Petersburg, which just has a few leaves of that preface of little bits on the Psalter. And then I found a Vatican one, which turned out to be really interesting because it also contains copies of letters, which I interpreted to be the letters between an abbot and a translator saying, look, I got this Greek text with all these nice introductions to the Psalms. Can you translate it for us so that we can use it? So you sort of find a little background of the text itself. Now, you notice that I was showing photographs or images of manuscripts that are in Western libraries. And so that's going to be one little thread of the tale today. So these are all things which were taken to places like the Vatican, or they were taken to the British Library, or they were taken to Milan, or they were taken to St. Petersburg in the colonial era. So this is the kind of plunder that has made the great museums of Europe the great museums of Europe. You know, you get your Egyptian stuff and so on. And most of the scholarship that is done on these traditions until fairly recently is based on those manuscripts because those are the ones that people could get. But what we're realizing is that that is a partial view. So it'd be as if you went to the British Museum and you looked at a mummy case and you said, now I know everything there is to know about ancient Egypt. Not even realizing that the pyramids and the temples, they're still there. And if you want to understand the culture, you have to bring that into your understanding. The other thing I discovered as I worked with that original manuscript, the British Library one I mentioned, is it has an amazing little bit of Latin marginalia. Now, the story of a manuscript. This manuscript was written in Mesopotamia, 7th, 8th century, taken to Egypt in the 9th century, because they had a monastery in Egypt which was full of Syriac tradition monks. And sometime around the 12th century, somebody showed up at the monastery in Egypt who was from the West and said, well, what's this text? And whatever language they were speaking, or translators, oh, it's Psalm 140. And he says, well, I'll write the same text in Latin. So you have this little bit of Latin left by a pilgrim, a crusader, a trader. We really have no idea. But this is another thing that points to the significance of manuscripts for witnessing to cultural contact. We think we're the first sort of era of humans who have traveled the globe and who have had this wide network of travel experiences. Not so. So here's a little close-up of that wonderful little bit of Latin marginalia. Now, my paleographer friends, those are people who study ancient writing, say it's not a very sophisticated hand. So this is not a professional scribe. This is a cleric or somebody who knew how to read and write, but would never have made a living writing out manuscripts, like me. Another quick example, and this also shows some of the complexity of the evidence. Aphrahat, he's known as Aphrahat, we don't really know what his actual name is, Syriac ascetic author of the 4th century, wrote texts about the ascetic, the sort of pre-monastic form of Christian asceticism, which are now considered essential for understanding early Syriac Christianity. Well, you know what? Apparently, the people in his own tradition didn't think so, because there's one manuscript of his writings. So, as so often happens, in scholarship, we erect a kind of skyscraper of scholarship on a foundation that's about the size of a dime. And then somebody finds a quarter or even something larger, and you have to rewrite everything you know because you're only working with what was taken to London in the 19th century. In this manuscript, tucked in the back of it, was this little fragment, this little slip of vellum. It's very difficult to see it, but it's a Latin text in a hand of the 5th century. So roughly contemporary with the Syriac manuscript. How the heck did that get in there? In Egypt. The other wrinkle is that because Aphrahat was no longer copied in Syriac. He fell out of favor. They had new monastic writings. He was passé. The best memory of his work was preserved in Latin by a 5th century Latin chronicler called Gennadius of Marseille. And he had a list of Christian authors, which continued one begun by St. Jerome. And he says there was a writer in Persia, he calls him Jacob, that's a whole other story. And he gives a table of contents of all of Averhat's writings, which means that all the manuscripts we photographed in Europe for Himmel, Latin manuscripts of Gennadius's treatise, preserve the memory of a man who was forgotten in his own native tradition. And you wouldn't even know that unless you had some sense of what was happening with the manuscripts. So, to the point of the knowledge base we have, those manuscripts got to Europe. The Vatican ones were taken mainly through a Maronite Christian Lebanese family called the Asamanis. And they sort of ran the Vatican Library at one point. And here he is with his box of books brought from Egypt and other parts of the Middle East, laying them at the foot of the Pope, who says, "Take them away." So this is how the Vatican Library got Syriac manuscripts. And the British Library, that time still part of the British Museum, got even more. So the question becomes, what about the ones that stayed behind, that didn't go to Europe? And this is where the work of projects like Himmel become important. This is a precursor of Himmel's work in the form of a project that was in Leiden in Holland, now it's in Amsterdam, called the Peshitta Project. And the Peshitta is a form of the Syriac Bible, the most common Syriac translation of the Bible. And they started a project in the 1950s of going across the Near East looking for Syriac manuscripts of the Peshitta so that they could compare them with the manuscripts known from Europe and produce a critical edition. And the last volume of that critical edition is coming out next month. And they've invited me to come and give a lecture on Himmel's work of Syriac manuscripts to celebrate the completion of that project. So they microfilmed this one in Baghdad. And this is a copy of that text that I was working on. Now, I had to try to read this. And this is as good as the pictures are. It's microfilm, got a scan, you blow it up, you try to reverse the tonality, you do all these things. But at least it's something. And the point is, this manuscript is now gone. It's presumed to have been destroyed after 2003 in Iraq. And when we were able to rescue the bulk of that particular collection, it wasn't there, but many of them were simply a pile of dust. So this was a sort of pioneering effort to go get the stuff, but to do it in a way that protects the ownership and the rights of the original community. So it doesn't take the manuscript to Europe, makes a photographic copy of the manuscript, which can be used by scholars while leaving it in its original location. So this is where the monk part comes in. This is obviously a kind of modern analog of the traditional monastic enterprise of scribal activity, because monks have always been readers, and so monks and nuns in their monasteries would have books, but they typically would have people in their communities who could make their own copies, because otherwise it's really expensive to go out and buy a manuscript from a professional. And so the founder of our project, Father Oliver, here's his portrait over in Himmel, looking very medieval, just like that. He's got the quill in his hand. Oliver was actually a modern monk, and he's the one who came up with this notion of sending microfilm cameras around Austria to photograph Benedictine manuscripts before they were vaporized in World War III. This was in 1965. I'm old enough to remember the Cold War, 3 years after the Cuban Missile Crisis, a very chilly period in Soviet-American relations. It could have happened, and Austria would have been right on the front line of a ground war. So Oliver's the one who got it going. So there's the great old VW bus. Some of us remember from our youth. That's what surfers had, right? But that one had a microfilm camera in it. And here he is set up in one of the Austrian libraries with stacks of medieval manuscripts on the floor. We try to be a little more careful these days. The microfilm set up to the camera and then the microfilm reader. And in doing this work, Oliver was really continuing the monastic work of a modern Benedictine congregation of the 17th and 18th century And this was the Benedictine congregation of Saint-Maur, the Maurists. And they had a monastery at Saint-Germain-des-Prés in Paris, and maybe some of you have visited that church. Church is still there, monastery gone, of course, in the French Revolution. And they had monks there who collected manuscripts, Western European manuscripts, their own tradition. And they either took them to their monastery because nobody wanted manuscripts anymore, because in Europe they had printing by then, or they would make copies. And from the manuscripts in their library, they began to produce printed critical editions of important early Christian texts. So it's really modern scientific scholarship. But it had to be done for manuscripts because there weren't previous printed editions that they could use. So they would undertake these literary voyages, these voyages littéraires, where they get on a donkey and they go from church to church, monastery to monastery in Europe, saying, you got any manuscripts? Can we have a look? You want to sell them? Can we copy them? Whatever. And then they produced their editions. Now in this, they and Father Oliver were reproducing the travel itineraries of great medieval travelers. And this map is great because you have the Jewish traveler and explorer Benjamin of Tudela. You have Marco Polo, of course, very famous, coming from Italy to China. You have Ibn Battuta, the Arab traveler and chronicler. And you see how these guys got around in the pre-modern era. And so this is just a known example of trade routes, pathways, and all along those travel itineraries, ideas and culture were passing, including manuscripts. So this is where we switch to me. So there's Father Oliver looking lofty with a quill in his hand, and this is a more accurate depiction of why it takes a Texan to do what Himmel is doing now. All right? Isn't that great? You know, good shot even then. So this is my travel itinerary between December and May of this past year. And I didn't do quite as much as Marco Polo did, but this was just a few months, right? So trying to take advantage now of the ability we have to travel more speedily, even if not always comfortably, and the leverage provided by digital technology, we can accomplish so much more quickly than the patient labors of the medieval monks who copied by hand, or the Maurists who produced their printed editions, or even the work of Himmel in the microfilm era, when you communicated with projects in Europe by sending an aerogram, and you don't even know what an aerogram is, right? And you would wait 10 days for it to get there, 10 days for it to get back, and if you were writing to Ethiopia, where we also did work, you waited a lot longer than that. So one way to think of what we've been trying to do at Himmel, at least in the first phase of our digital era since 2003, is recovering a sense of the Christian world as it really was historically. And this is a 1581 engraving by Heinrich Bunting, which depicts the Christian world as having three equal components: Europe, Asia, and Africa. And people forget about the fact that Christianity is in fact of Asian, Middle Eastern origin, and forget about the fact that Africa, before the arrival of Islam, Northern Africa, Egypt, Ethiopia, were Christian countries, flourishing Christian cultures. And then the holy city of Jerusalem in the middle. So if you look at the Asia part of this, Antioch, Damascus, Babylon, which is also Baghdad, Mosul, which is ancient Nineveh, these are the sorts of places we have become interested in. So our approach, to those of you who haven't heard a pitch like this before, is very straightforward. We photograph whole collections. We cover regions rather than isolated collections. So we don't just want one little library somewhere. We would like to do as many in one place as we can, because that gives a broader sense of the manuscript culture and then provides a greater resource for matching with what's in European and American libraries. We train and employ local workers. We did that right from the start when we were working in Europe. And then we safely archive the images so the digital data is safe in perpetuity, and we share them online. And then finally, this has emerged as something really important in what we do. We can track what happens to collections that get damaged, destroyed, relocated because of some of the things I'll talk about now. So I begin my story in Mesopotamia. And I want to talk about Mesopotamia as a very important region for ancient Christianity, not just for the kind of birth of what we think of as modern human civilization. This is a view of the Mesopotamian plain from the Turkish-Syrian border, looking south into Syria, back in the days when I could go to Syria pretty easily. So if you look at a map, you've got these ancient cities. It's a 4th century depiction of cities and places, and then the modern names. And so you see Aleppo, we're familiar with from the destruction of Aleppo in the Syrian Civil War. You have Mosul, which was a hotspot in the rise of ISIS and the battle against them. Erbil, capital of the Kurdish region, which is very geopolitically sensitive because of oil. And Diyarbakir, which is the flashpoint right now of tension between Kurds and Turks. These were all ancient Christian centers. And these are all places with manuscripts where we have worked. So Mardin, which is sort of poised between Mosul and Diyarbakir, not all that far from Aleppo, 3 hours drive maybe, now looks like a typical sort of Middle Eastern city, lots of concrete buildings built around an ancient citadel with some important historic madrasas, but also in the heart of it, very important churches like this 6th century church of the 40 Martyrs, which serves the remaining 100 Christians of Mardin. This city was 50% Christian until 1922. You've heard of the Armenian genocide? There was also a genocide of Syriac Christians, which was a kind of next phase of persecution of minorities in the rise of the modern Turkish state and also the tensions between Turks and Kurds. The result was the death of thousands upon thousands of people and then the forced migration of others, and we'll hear more about this shortly. But there's still a church and there's still one priest who takes care of all the Christians left in Mardin, whatever their original tradition. And in the attic of his church are about 1,200 of the most important Syriac manuscripts in the world, just sort of there. So here's one of them, a particularly handsome 13th century Illuminated Gospel book. And this was our first project working in that sort of Mesopotamian, southeastern Turkish realm. We were so aware of the history and were reminded of the fact that just down the road of that church was a Chaldean Catholic church, which is another branch of the Syriac Christian family. That's a whole lecture in itself. Just take my word for it. Typical street scene in Mardin. This church, too, had a very important manuscript collection that was cataloged by a great scholar of the Chaldean church, Adai Sher. Archbishop Sher was killed in 1915 as part of that round of attack on Christians, most famously Armenians then, and then the Syriac one just a few years later. And his library in Sirte was burned. He had cataloged the manuscripts of Mardin and Diyarbakir, and we've used those catalogs to try to reconstruct what we were then able to photograph. And among the treasures of the libraries in this region, I'll just show you one. You saw the Illuminated Gospel. This is a 6th century gospel book, and that's a 6th century depiction of Christ. A lot different from medieval stuff, a lot different from Western stuff, almost ethereal, floating on the page. So these are the kinds of treasures which now are becoming accessible through the digitization work that we've done. We began our work in Syria in 2005 in Aleppo. And Aleppo is a great center of everything in Syria. It's Syria's second city. And it has its famous medieval citadel, its lovely Umayyad mosque. But of course, we know from recent history, the city has suffered terribly. There's a part of its story that few people know, and that is that in 1922, it welcomed Syriac Christian refugees from Turkey who found safety in northern Syria. Aleppo, a very cosmopolitan city. At that time, it had a significant Jewish community, every kind of Christian you can imagine, majority Muslim. Everybody got along because it was all about business, right? So it was a real trading center, a commercial center. And these Christians came from a place called Edessa or Urfa in southeast Turkey, which is the birthplace of the Syriac language as a written form of that linguistic tradition. Not a single Christian left there because they were all pushed out in 1922. And they came to Aleppo and they brought their manuscripts. And among the manuscripts they brought was the only surviving complete copy of a 12th century history of the world by a Syriac Orthodox patriarch named Michael the Great. Okay, that's a lot of information that I just injected here. These world histories were typical of that period. You take old historical sources, you'd add them, you'd bring them into yours, you'd supplement with current events, and that's the way history looks. And you'd often, as in this case, have a column about world events, column about local political events, column about church events. And so these are priceless witnesses to what was actually happening, particularly the more recent material. So he's writing this in the 12th century. And one of the stories that he tells is what happened to the Christians of the Middle East when the European Crusaders arrived to liberate the Holy Land. So who took the heat? The local Christians, just like happened in 2003 in the invasion of Iraq. And so the local Christians were punished, it says, by being told they could no longer ring their church bells or sound their church bells. They didn't necessarily ring them like we do. And this is their punishment for the sins of their European co-religionists who thought they were coming to bring freedom. And the result, of course, was a loss of freedom for the local Christians. Well, we know what happened in Aleppo, the destruction of that mosque, severely damaged. That's the minaret, that pile of rubble there. The destruction of its historic market. The place on the left, the Greek Catholic Archbishopric, is where I used to stay with the Archbishop, who's a dear friend of mine. This is the Armenian Cathedral, severely damaged. These buildings were right on the dividing line in Aleppo between the part of the city that was destroyed and the part of the city where life continued as if nothing were happening. This is modern warfare. You can target it that precisely. We digitized both collections, but people suffered. Among them, our friend Marginalia Gregorios Ibrahim, the Syriac Orthodox Archbishop of Aleppo, who allowed us to photograph that manuscript of Michael. Always a gracious host. Kidnapped in April of 2013, never heard from again, along with his Greek Orthodox counterpart. So we have seen this happen in real time, in recent years, during the lifetime of the work that we do. So we'll go somewhere happy like Iraq. So everything we did in the Middle East after 2003 was done in the shadow of the invasion of Iraq in 2003. We planned the project before that happened, but then by the time we actually started cameras working in Lebanon, the invasion had occurred. So on this anniversary of 9/11, where all of this stuff began, Afghanistan, Iraq, the collapse of what was perhaps an already unstable Middle East, but nonetheless the collapse of the Middle East as we had known it since the First World War, this is what we've been working with. In Iraq, we have worked with Father Najib Mikhail. He's a Dominican friar. Nice shot, right? Benedict in black, Dominican white. He's now the Archbishop of Mosul. No Christians in Mosul. They're all outside of Mosul. But he's the Archbishop. That's kind of a poison chalice. But he's a magnificent pastor, taking care of Chaldean Christians in the so-called Nineveh Plain, or the Nineveh Triangle. So there's Mosul, right? Big center for ISIS. There's Erbil, the Kurdish capital, and dozens of little Christian villages which have been there forever in between. And this was precisely the area that became a battleground with the rise of ISIS. There were Jewish villages there too, but all the Jews had to leave in the 1950s because of what happened between Arab countries and the state of Israel. So gradually, the sort of multi-ethnic, multi-religious nature of these places, which had always been there, is being erased. So you get very interesting sort of local artistic traditions like this, which people might think is sort of naive folk art. It's a lot more interesting than that when you spend time with it. Their own very distinctive indigenous forms of manuscript illumination and depiction of stories. Now, we started there in 2009, and some of you may remember in June of 2014, ISIS seemed to come from nowhere, intelligence fail, and conquered Mosul. And the Iraqi army just abandoned the city in a matter of hours. And then in August of 2014, ISIS started moving east toward the Kurdish capital. And they were interested in oil, so that's why they wanted to move closer to where the oil was. And so what happened is the Kurdish troops who used to guard the Christian villages pulled back to the Kurdish frontier, and all the Christians had hours to get out and to walk 40 miles in August in Iraq to Erbil, to the Kurdish capital, to find safety, grabbing whatever they could. So you take the baby, you take the sheep, and fortunately, many of them have been able to take their manuscripts, but not all. So ISIS set to its evil work, demolishing ancient Nineveh, one of the most important Assyrian sites of northern Iraq, for which they used barrel bombs and bulldozers, blowing up shrines at the monastery of Mar-Beynam near Mosul, very important Assyrian Catholic monastery with an important manuscript collection, and then occupied the whole area until they were driven out beginning in 2016 and then ending with the final conquest of Mosul in the fall of 2017, leaving behind a desecrated monastery at Mar-Beynam with that sort of emblem of ISIS spray painted all over the place, the important old sculptures in the church, each one defaced, any depiction of an angel, a saint, Christ, the Blessed Virgin, of course, destroyed. But in one of the few good news stories of that conflict, the manuscripts were saved. And at Christmas 2016, the monastery had just been liberated, and they went back, and it turned out what they had done is built a false wall in a broom closet right next to the gate of the monastery. So the ISIS people were there like all day, all the time. Didn't realize a fake wall behind it, barrels filled with the manuscript collection. Now, this had been digitized already with our Iraqi partners, and this is a good news story, they were saved. But the things that were digitized in Mosul, many of them are now destroyed. Among them, some of the most important Syriac manuscript collections in the Near East. And meanwhile, it's not just old stuff. This is the library of Mosul University, considered to be one of the best university libraries in the Middle East. So serving local population, educating people in every conceivable form of knowledge, a very important engineering school and so on. And ISIS burned the books, and the Americans destroyed the building. So that sort of hole in the ceiling is from the bombing, which was viewed as essential for the reconquest of the city. So Father Najib and his team have done their best to recover what they can. His own community's library, the Dominican Friary, they had a small community living in one of the Christian villages after they had to leave Mosul. This was their library. It's not manuscripts, printed books, theology books, but it was their library. And that became just a pile of ashes. And in the charred remnants of their building in Karakosh, one of these villages, where they were digitizing the manuscripts, look what we found. One of our project sheets. So they were working right up until the time they had to leave. This is not a posed photograph. We were actually going up the stairs through the ashes of what had been burned, and that was on one of the steps. Phew. So he and his young team of Iraqis are doing what they can. Beautiful 12th century manuscripts like this, severely damaged, many of them simply beyond repair. And so if they had been photographed, great. If they hadn't been photographed, in most cases, it's too late. So now I'm going to turn to something completely different for the latter part of my remarks. And that is to say a little bit about why we work with Islamic manuscripts. So the Christian stuff is logical, right? So we're Western Christians. We know that Christianity comes from the Middle East. If you understand the background and development of Christianity, you have to go back to that region. And text moved. You heard me say earlier, Greek went into Syriac, Latin authors knew about Syriac writings. You sort of have to get all of these traditions together to try to reconstruct what happened in any one of them. 2011, we were doing a training session in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, for teaching Ethiopians how to digitize manuscripts. And there was a guy called Abdullahi Ali Sharif from a town called Harar, which is the historic center of Ethiopian Islam. And he's a great character, collector of manuscripts, collector of every kind of culture related to the history of Harar. And Abdullahi said, do you want copies of our manuscripts? I said, well, if somebody offers you a hard drive, you take it, right? Because you never know. We didn't get very far in telling him you shouldn't put the manuscript next to the incense burner, the sort of, charcoal burner there, the brazier. But hey, one little lesson at a time. But the real breakthrough with our turn toward a wider understanding of what we do came in 2013. 13. And that was in Jerusalem. We've been working with Christian libraries in the old city of Jerusalem. We have a Palestinian Christian who works for us, still works for us, now starting a project in Gaza. And David said one of his Muslim friends had said, well, what about our library? We have manuscripts too. Would you be interested in digitizing those? And David said, well, let me ask the boss. So David asked me. And I think about it, and I realized we had been photographing Christian manuscripts about 150 yards from this library. These people had lived together for centuries. They greeted each other in the streets, they traded, they argued about religion, philosophy. If we want to understand, again, the culture of any one of those libraries, Christian or Muslim, don't we want all of them? So then we can trace some of those exchanges. So this particular library is right next to the Haram al-Sharif, also known as the Temple Mount for Jews, one of the most explosive bits of religious geography on the planet. And the library building and the room where they digitized the manuscripts has this $1 million view of the Dome of the Rock. So talk about threatened. I mean, it's one bomb, one fire, one crazy person. There are a lot of crazy people in Jerusalem. And there's no monopoly of one particular religion or ethnicity on craziness. Most people in Jerusalem are crazy. It drives you that way. So this was a major project starting to work with the historic Muslim families of Jerusalem, and in the end, 4 of them. So very significant collections of Islamic manuscripts living side by side with the Christian ones that we digitized. But all of this was a preliminary to our greatest adventure, and that's my last travelogue-y story for the day. And that's our work in West Africa, in Mali. This is the River Nazaire, and the secret to understanding anything about this part of West Africa is the river. Much of this is quite arid if you get away from the water, but the River Nazaire has a magnificent inland delta, which creates a very fertile region in the heart of the West African country, now known as Mali. Formerly, it was known as French Sudan before independence in the 1960s. So a beautiful, tranquil sunset from the balcony of the room I stay in when I go there. The room isn't very fancy, but the view is pretty sweet. So we've been working in Mali with the manuscripts of Timbuktu. And so A, Timbuktu really does exist. It's a place. B, you can go there, though with great difficulty, as I'll explain. C, at one time, Timbuktu was a really important political and intellectual center because it had a strategic location. So here you see the river, and then you see these caravan routes which sort of go off of key stopping points on the river. And the traffic in this region, you can see it summarized here, gold, slaves, ivory, and salt was really important for Timbuktu because north of Timbuktu, in this area, there were enormous fields of salt, which can be excavated, and that's still actually a major industry there. So the caravans are going back and forth, trading these various commodities, including human commodities. And then you can see that they're in touch with people in Morocco, over to Cairo. And because Timbuktu was a major political center, it also attracted scholars, center of Islam in Mali. So they had manuscripts. And then time sort of forgot Timbuktu. Pathways changed, trade changed. But manuscripts stayed along with vestiges of that incredible medieval culture. So there's a very distinctive West African form of architecture, this sort of mud architecture, which you can see here, which is really beautiful. And they have manuscripts. And here's the son of the imam of the Djinguer Mosque there, who's also the archivist of their library. And there are still distinguished religious figures in Timbuktu associated with the 3 major mosques. So here's the imam of the Sankore Mosque, who is, you meet the guy and you think this could be 100 years ago, the way he lives, the way he thinks, but such wisdom and such practical sense, which they have needed to survive their recent turmoils. Typical street scene in Timbuktu as people are going to the mosque. Well, Timbuktu became a very dangerous place in 2012. There was a combination of forces which involved what they call jihadis, we would call Islamists, I mean these sort of fanatical ISIS types. Tuaregs, that's an ethnic group in that sort of northern Malian region heading north. and others who came together and invaded northern Mali and captured Timbuktu. Before then, Timbuktu had been a real sort of tourist destination. It's romantic, the name. It was the center of Malian music, which is just about the best music in Africa. And life stopped. They occupied the city for several months. It was then liberated by French paratroopers, and peace is now kept in Timbuktu through foreign intervention. But boy, do they have manuscripts. So here's a great example of an Islamic legal text with Marginalia, as people have studied and commented. It's sort of like manuscripts of the Talmud in Judaism, where you have the original text, and then you have Rabbi this says that, and you write all that in the margin. And you have a kind of conversation happening in the form of a manuscript. And something that we found last December, just sort of we're hanging out talking to the people about our project there, a little slip which had Persian on it. So we're a long way from Persia, right? With an Arabic translation, and it's a proverb basically sort of along the lines of, you know, when I was a kid, I knew stuff that kids know. When I'm grown up, I know different things like an adult knows. Sound familiar? Check out St. Paul. So this sort of proverbial wisdom that you just find across religious traditions. Now, most of the manuscripts of Timbuktu were secretly removed from the city before the jihadis arrived. Local people can tell when something's going to happen, right? It was like you sort of have a finger up in the wind and the wind is blowing the wrong way. So this man, Abdul Qadir Haidara, who is sometimes known, unfortunately, as the badass librarian of Timbuktu. There's a book, there's soon going to be a movie. Abdul Qadir belongs to one of the great families of Timbuktu, and he was the guardian of one of the largest family libraries. And this is a picture I'd taken just the end of July when I was in Mali the last time. Abdul Qadir organized an evacuation of manuscripts from Timbuktu, putting them in metal chests like this, which are used for river trade. So whatever stuff they're taking up and down the river in Mali, they put it in a little metal chest like this. And they throw it on one of these boats. Some are motorized, some are not, and they transport it. So he brought 1,400 of these boxes full of manuscripts, 200,000, 300,000, we don't even know how many yet, down to Bamako. Timbuktu dry, edge of the desert, Bamako humid, catastrophe for manuscripts in closed boxes like this because it breeds mold. So here they were in 2013. We established first contact August 2013. I went over, went back in December 2013, and we started a project. So we did training for them in 2014. We expanded the digitization studio over the years. And so at present, we have 10 cameras active in Bamako. And they've opened all the boxes. The manuscripts are safe now from a conservation perspective. The digitizing is happening even as we speak. So you've got a big group of young Malians who are documenting their own cultural heritage and beginning the process of description that we then continue when things come to us. But meanwhile, there were manuscripts still in Timbuktu. Some families said, we know how to take care of them. We hid them from the Moroccans, we hid them from the French, we can hide them from these guys. Take the other people's, but we'll keep our own. So we wanted to get up there and meet with these families and see if we could digitize their collections as well. So my first visit to Timbuktu in August of 2017 was with my colleague Walid Murad from Beirut. He does all the field projects for us. And being Lebanese, he's Francophone, because in Mali, everything is in French. So why did a kid in Houston take French in high school? You ask me, maybe it's proof of the existence of God, because I actually use it all the time now when I'm in places like here. So we go up in August of 2002 on a UN military flight, which is the only way to get up there, because it's all a military zone. Now, there are no commercial travel, there are no tourists. But sometimes you have a hard landing. And this is my favorite airport sign in the world. From the airport in, go figure, Beirut. And who thought that was a good idea to show the plane landing at that angle? So this kind of happened to us. We arrive in Timbuktu around lunchtime. We've been up since 3 in the morning because of security and getting to the airport and the military flight, all this stuff. We said, let's have some lunch. So we were having some lunch, and we heard something sound like firecrackers. And then Walid comes from Lebanon. He lived through a civil war, says, Abuna, it's the Arabic for, father. Abuna, those aren't firecrackers. So he's right, they weren't. There was an attack that we were practically next door to on a UN headquarters. It was the communications headquarters for all the UN forces in Timbuktu. And this is where we were. This is our little hotel, 150 yards, something like that. There's not much in between. And this attack continued for 8 hours. And so for 8 hours, we were holed up in room 4. I photographed it again when we went back on a later trip, using cell phones, Wi-Fi to contact all the embassies we had connections with. And fortunately, we had several, because we had a Swede who lives in the UK, we had a Russian who lives in Germany, we had me. So we had a lot of embassy numbers to call. And after about 8 hours, the Swedes came and got us. So they had a 4 Humvee convoy that came just to get us. And they had told us, you'll be fine, just hide in the room, don't go outside, they're not after you. The shooting got very close. They were obviously shooting in the garden right behind the hotel, but they weren't shooting at us, they were shooting at the UN people. About a dozen people died in that attack, both UN forces and some of the attackers. So we then spent 2 nights as prisoners of Swedish hospitality at Camp Nobel. Our colleague Sophie, who's the Swede who lives in London, looking fantastic as ever, queen of the desert in whatever circumstances she finds herself. I'm a little shell-shocked, but hey, we made it. So we got out, we went back to Bamako. A few months later, the airport in Timbuktu was basically blown up, and this is the way it still looks now. But Malian entrepreneurship continues. You can still go to the gift shop, and they heard that in English the word is shop, but in French CH is SH for us, so you can find the shoops if you want to buy the, my parents went to Timbuktu and all I got was the lousy t-shirt. They actually sell it. So we have been going back to Timbuktu. These days we stay on the UN camp, so this is the sort of typical accommodation. They have several thousand UN troops from all over Africa and several European countries. And when we go into town now, we have an escort. You can go in basically for one day during daylight hours. You have this cute little tankette, I don't know what you call that, which sort of follows us around, and armed troops. But we're working with 3 projects going up there. And again, you have young Timbuktu people who have no other job. Tourism is gone, right? That's the only industry they had in Timbuktu. And so they're able to work now, thanks to the support of our sponsors. So how do you add all this up? And I'm nearing the end here. People say, how many manuscripts have you digitized? And I say, here's some rough numbers, constantly changing. The key point here is this line. So this is all the European, North American libraries, holdings of Syriac, Ethiopic, Armenian, Christian Arabic. So all the stuff that was taken, right, in the 18th and 19th century. So there are 3,373 Syriac and Garshuni, that's Arabic written in Syriac script, manuscripts in those famous libraries. We photographed 15,000 in the Middle East. So talk about transforming perceptions of the corpus of literature, the canon of texts, and then the living intellectual culture of these places, which were copying manuscripts as late as, I think 1971 is the most recent one we found. Ballpoint pen. There were no printed copies of the text. You wanted one, you took out your little desk diary, those ones with the full page for each day, and you started copying a 4th century monastic text. Latin manuscripts, we already had over 90,000 in microfilm. The Islamic stuff, we already have close to 100,000 already here. Untold numbers still coming from the Timbuktu project. A little project in northern India I didn't have a chance to talk to you about today with Persian manuscripts, perhaps the first of many. So the beat goes on. So this is where we're working now. We still work in Europe, but in interesting places like the former Yugoslavia and Ukraine. Long-standing project in Malta, which is a fascinating story in itself in terms of a maritime crossroad in the Mediterranean. The Middle East work I've talked about, Africa I've mentioned, and then the work in India, and a brand new project in Kathmandu, Nepal, which started last week. And then next on the horizon is the Great Mosque in Gaza. So talk about geopolitically sensitive. And the goal is to put it all online. So check out himmel.org, our basic website, learn a little more about some of the places and cultures. The real action for scholars is vHimmel, virtual Himmel, which is where we're slowly putting all the digitized manuscripts, scans of microfilms, descriptions of microfilms we haven't yet scanned. And so you can go look at the reading room in vHimmel, and this is where you get access to everything. And one of the things that we note in vHimmel is what happened to the manuscript after it was photographed. So, is it still there? Was it destroyed like Mosul? Was it relocated like just about everything in northern Iraq? Is it missing because nobody knows where it is? Was it sold? I'll give you an example of that in a minute. Or is it simply unknown? So what can happen to manuscripts besides war? So you're in Ethiopia. You're learning how to read your ancient liturgical language in 2005. And the priest hands you a manuscript. Says, start reading this. Because they still have manuscripts in parish churches there. Tourist comes along and says, boy, that's a handsome manuscript. I'll give you $50 for that. You're an Ethiopian kid. You're poor. You say, I'll take it. $50 goes a long way. So what happens? Manuscript we microfilmed in Ethiopia in 1979, now in a prominent collector's collection in Oslo, Norway. Provenance of the manuscript, the name of the most notorious dealer in, shall we say, vaguely sourced manuscript material. So this is the kind of thing we're tracking. Another web resource I just want to alert you to is vHimmel School. So if I've caught your imagination with Syriac or paleography, check out vHimmel School. We'll teach you how to decipher Syriac characters in script, Latin scripts. It's a lot of fun. So here's your chance to look at a Syriac page. You can practice transcribing it. I mean, this is a real geek out opportunity. And that ought to be a safe thing to say in a room full of people like this. And then we have one more thing, online digital resource, which we call vHimmel DH, Digital Humanities, which shows you the potential for taking all of that digital information and creating really cool things like maps and timelines and tracing textual transmission. And this is where scholarship in the humanities is at now, is leverage the power of big data to give us these more complete understandings of history. So there are the URLs, easy enough, himmel.org, vhimmel.org. A word to our sponsors. We are the platonic form of a not-for-profit organization, so we rely entirely on the kindness of strangers and friends to support the work that we do, particularly Arcadia in London, the NEH, huge supporter. And that leads me to the last thing, which I show with reluctance, but I am required to do this by my staff, and that is to remind you of the fact that there's a lecture coming up, and we really hope that people will either watch the live stream here in this room or watch it at home in your jammies, if that's more comfortable. And the opportunity that we've been given in this lecture is to give a sort of more coherent, more kind of literary version of some of the themes I mentioned today. Why manuscripts matter, how it makes a difference for cultural understanding, why a Benedictine monk is working with Muslim communities, and then most importantly, to bring it home to our country and the issues that we face in dealing with our own blood-soaked history of the indigenous peoples as well as chattel slavery. And then in an event we'll have in November, we'll have a sort of Minnesota-focused event as a follow-up to talk about the present-day fact of cultural heritage in a very multicultural place like the Twin Cities. So we have a lot of good things going on, and come on down. Thank you. So I know some people probably need to go home, but if others would like to stay for a few minutes and we could have a little Q&A, it's really up to you. But if people need to leave, this is a good time to do it. And we won't do this for more than just a few minutes, just if anybody wants to stay and has something they'd like to talk about. Thanks, Richard. We'll see you. Rob's heard several versions of this. Thanks, BDP. Okay, we're going to start taking Q&A, so if you're leaving, do it quietly. Go with God. Thanks for coming. Jennifer.
First of all, I cannot two highly badass librarian in Timbuktu. Wonderful book, wonderful book. Secondly, completely different topic. 3 years ago, Tom and I were in Iran, and we visited Muslim Orthodox community in Islam.
Mm-hmm.
It is a wonderful library with history. They are, they're not microfilming as far as I know, but they had their goal was to preserve that Armenian heritage. And so I wondered if there were any plans to, because Iran was not on your list.
Iran is not on my list, but we have designs. I mean, our motto is Himmel über alles. So, as it,
With the book from the Bible.
oh, great. So as a matter of fact, I had lunch with their bishop in Beirut in May, who's a new bishop, a young bishop, terrific guy. And he's very interested in doing a digital project because they don't know what's going to happen to their community. They're, as I'm sure they told you, maybe at that time, but especially since, most of their community is left because the bite of the sanctions on Iran has been ferocious, especially in the last few months, and minorities are very afraid because just like those Christians in the Middle East at the time of the Crusades, Michael the Great referred to, they tend to take the heat if there's tension between the majority population and a Western Christian government or military force. So we are in contact with them. The great thing about having this base in Beirut and having a Lebanese working for us is Lebanese people can go to Iran easily because of the Shia, Hezbollah, their advantages to Hezbollah. So that's one of them, is Lebanon and Iran actually have pretty good relations. So we are in contact with them, and I'd love to do something there, but nothing yet.
You seem to intentionally drop a thread at one point. What is it about living in Jerusalem that drives everybody crazy?
They call it Jerusalem syndrome. So there are two forms of madness in Jerusalem. There's one form of madness is the Western pilgrim who goes there and experiences some kind of, it's not really a religious conversion, but they sort of end up doing weird things. Example, the first 20 years I would go to Jerusalem, there was a guy we all called King David, who would stand over by the entry to the Temple Mount, because it was going from the Jewish side, so we'll call it the Temple Mount, from their side, and the Rama Sharif if you're going from the other side. And he wore a robe and a gold crown, and he played a harp. And he really thought he was King David. And so apparently there is a thing, you can look it up online. People go to psychiatric hospitals there because they have these sort of experiences. And that's because it is such a kind of point of cosmic convergence for Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, complicated modern history. It's very beautiful and interesting from a cultural perspective, and apparently that overwhelms people. Now I'm fascinated by the place, but I haven't had any psychotic episodes yet. I have those at home, I don't need to go to Jerusalem. So then the other thing is the sheer tension of the political situation pushes people to just lose it. Ordinary, sane, rational people just get to that point one day where they say, I'm not going to take it anymore. And this is how you get the random violence, like, stabbings that happen, which are not organized terrorist activity. There's simply somebody saying, finally, I can't take care of my family, I can't go back to my village, what am I going to do? And you have the same sort of feelings on the other communities as well. So this is what makes it so volatile. And then they have an election, of course, next week. The prime minister has announced the intention to annex large parts of the West Bank. Stay tuned. This could get worse. So that's what I meant. Tom.
Thank you so much. At the start of your lecture, you talked about how you were chasing down these manuscripts in all these libraries all over the world that had the same reference you were looking for. Do they have that online where you just say, oh, let's see, does the Vatican have anything? Or how do you find out that you can go there? I mean, you obviously didn't go through the whole Vatican library looking for one word. So
Actually, that's a good question, something I meant to mention earlier, which is how did I get copies of those things? So the manuscripts in the great libraries of the West are for the most part cataloged. Not entirely. The Vatican is a bit of a mess, actually, with Syriac manuscripts. But they've been studied enough that there are references in scholarly literature. So you can usually track it down. Then the question becomes, can you have access? And so some of them are online. The Milan manuscript I showed briefly at the beginning is a 19th century lithograph. They actually made a lithograph of a complete manuscript. I mean, it's a work of art. It's just magnificent. The one from St. Petersburg, I had a friend in the National Library of Russia, and it's very difficult to get stuff and very expensive because they need to make money for the library because they have no money anymore. But she just took pictures with her phone for me. The Vatican ones are online, but they're not online in high resolution. So if you want a higher resolution, you got to pay for it. The London stuff, I actually took the pictures I showed you, the London manuscript with the Latin Marginalia myself, because the British Library, an enlightened institution, which is all about serving patrons, lets you photograph stuff. So you can stand there with a manuscript, they hand you a 7th century manuscript, you sit down at the desk, you pull out your phone, you take pictures. It's all about access. So eventually all this stuff will be online, at least the Western stuff.
So do you have confidence that you have a reasonable percentage of the manuscripts that refer to what you were looking for? Or is this just like, these are the ones you found, and there's who knows how much of them?
I think I have a pretty good sense for that particular project of the manuscripts that are in the Western collections. But the known unknown for manuscript studies is the manuscripts that never survived. They're just lost over the years. They were burned at some point. They wore out. They were reused to bind others. And so trying to figure out what percentage of the original data set do we actually have. For the stuff I was looking at, 2%, 1%, who knows? But it's surely a tiny fraction of what originally would have been there if you had been able to do a comprehensive census, say in the 9th century, of every known copy of Psalters with that preface. So before Islam had really begun to reduce the Christian population, before the Mongols came and burned down major Syriac libraries in the Middle Ages, before the calamities of the 19th and 20th century. We just don't know. So we work with what we have. This is the part where you make guesses and extrapolate hypotheses. And if somebody proves you wrong later because they found a new manuscript, great. That's what we want. What else? Yeah.
Just wondering, is there any location that you've always dreamed of going to that you haven't quite made it to yet? Where would your dream destination be at this point?
The Canadian Arctic, but that's not for manuscripts. For manuscript work, we would like to do more in the Caucasus, in Armenia and Georgia. It has proven extremely difficult to make relationships there. The post-Soviet space generally is very complicated for natural reasons. We do work in Ukraine, but we work in Western Ukraine, which is a little more oriented toward Western Europe than is the case of Eastern Ukraine, as you know. They're fighting right now. So that's an area of great interest because that is a place, 2 Christian countries with distinctive languages and traditions, which also preserve many of these other texts from Greek and Syriac. So we'd love to do something there, but just hasn't happened yet.
First of all, thank you for doing this work. It's absolutely amazing. But I'm wondering how this became your life's work.
The abbot calls you in one day and says, we have an issue at Himmel, and we sort of need somebody to unlock the door on Monday. I mean, that's how it happened. I was sort of involved in the Lebanon project because I had some Middle Eastern background in some of the languages. And then there were some issues in the library. And, Friday afternoon there was no director. And they changed the locks. And Brother Dietrich said, I'm going to give you the key because nobody's keys will work on Monday morning. And can you go there and let them in and sort of assure them everything's okay? And then it sort of went from there.
And that was what year?
2003. September 3rd. September 7th, 2003, right, or first week of September, I think. Yeah. Tom, you have your hand? And then we'll come back to Jim. Yeah. Tom and then Jim.
What there's the famous manuscript for Archimedes was a palimpsest. How common is that when you do your stuff? Do you say, oh, well, the thing I came to photograph was this, but underneath it, there's another one?
It is sadly not very common in our project. We actually have a palimpsest, and my colleague Melissa's here because she's been real interested in it. We have a leaf of a manuscript, an actual manuscript leaf, that somehow got to Himmel. Matt's in the back. I don't think we know where that thing came from, right? We found it in a drawer, and we're just trying to catalog everything we got. And it's the palimpsest. It was originally thought it was Armenian on top and Syriac on the bottom. Turns out it's Georgian, medieval Georgian. And the Syriac underneath is like 6th, 7th century Syriac. It's like really, really old. And so we were working with somebody to do multispectral imaging. It's in the recent issue of the Himmel magazine. The guy's going to be on campus next week. So that's a really interesting thing, but that's not typical of what we're finding. You find a lot of palimpsests in places like Sinai, where the monastery is a stable community for centuries, which has seen a lot of change in membership, different cultural groups coming and going. And so there you find a lot of manuscripts which have been basically washed and then rewritten in another language. And there's been a big project, which the guy who's coming next week was involved in, to do multispectral imaging of all of the Sinai palimpsests. And that's really exciting because they're finding texts, previously unknown texts, in the underwriting. So I wish we had more, but I'm honestly not aware of any that we've come across, apart from the one in our own basement. So check your basements, people. You never know. So maybe Jim, last question.
This talk was not so much about content as about procedure, but could you just give a quick example of how, once you get outside of the Western holdings, the perceptions or understanding of the history of Christianity may have been changing, due to these new manuscripts? Not new, but new to us.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think one thing that you can see is the way intellectual culture continues to the modern era. And it's very interesting to see which manuscripts kept getting copied. And that tells you sort of where the values were. So you can see the influence of Latin missionaries, for example, at a certain period. They translate a lot of stuff into Arabic, some of it into kind of modern dialects of Syriac or Aramaic. So you see changes like that, but you also find, so I'll tell you real life examples, I found. Manuscript from Iraq, held by the Dominicans, formerly in Mosul, now it's in Erbil by way of Karakosh and then the back of a truck to evacuate it. 16th, 17th century manuscript. I can't get any of my expert friends to agree, but we're all sort of in that ballpark. It's one of 3 known copies of a very important mystical treatise written by a guy called Evagrius Ponticus, 4th century Egyptian author. My student is smiling. So if you've heard of Origen, Origen very important to Evagrius hugely important in Syriac tradition, despite the fact that he was influenced by Origen, but he never uses Origen's name, so they didn't put 2 and 2 together. This is a really esoteric treatise. It's full of all sorts of speculative theology, which really was not, kind of orthodox. So the text was copied that late. The 2 other manuscripts, the latest one is the 9th century. So this says 700 years later, somebody is still copying this text, which means it's still being read, which means there was another copy from which they copied to make that one, which says, well, when you ask what happened to that particular current of spirituality in Syriac Christianity, and people say, oh, it passed and it all got replaced by this later sort of more locked down Orthodox stuff. Somebody was reading it. And so that's the kind of rethinking of assumptions about religious and intellectual traditions that becomes possible when you get a fuller data set by adding these digitized collections to what we know from the Western libraries. And our catalogers have found previously unknown texts. We haven't found a new gospel yet. I keep telling David, come on, David, we need a Nat Geo cover story. Find me a gospel. Hasn't happened yet, but if you're really into textual history, some interesting discoveries. And the West African stuff from Mali is going to be a whole new thing. Very distinctive culture of Islam, local intellectual traditions, local cultural traditions. And we're delighted that a young Malian, who's a French-educated scholar, will be joining our staff. I think October 1 is when Ali is starting. He'll be with us for 2 years, trying to figure out how you catalog that tsunami of stuff from Mali. But that could be really, really interesting. And when we think about the African American population of this country, where do they come from, people? West Africa. So you never know how things are going to connect to something that brings it pretty close to home. So I think with that, we're going to let people go home. And so thanks again.